19th century France was a different world. It was a time and a place of political turmoil, of civil unrest and social upheaval, of great battles won, of changing political climates, and the transformation of national identity. In short, it was a time of revolution. With that transformation, it also brought a new literary movement in France, the Romantic movement. Today we'll be talking about one of the greatest writers in this movement and how his work influences us today. Hello and welcome back to the library. Before we get lost amongst the stacks, I wanted to introduce my guest today. Always out in search for the Holy Grail, always there to help you make bail, occasionally chasing tail, Indiana Bones himself. My brother Jacek.
Oh, Indiana Bones. I just not expecting that.
No.
All right. Also would have accepted, never mind. You can cut White Rhino.
White Rhino.
That's another nickname, but yeah.
Now, Jacek, before we talk about our protagonist, Alexander Dumas, I am going to just up front apologize for all the butchering of French names and words. I might as well just get that over right on the top of the strip because I'm going to need to power through them. Even though I took 4 years of French, it was in America, and I've literally retained none of it. So do you know anything about Alexander Dumas before we start?
More about his father, because he was more interested in the French Revolution, and I guess Victor Hugo was another person who was one of Dumas' contemporaries. But yeah, so I know of Thomas Alexander Dumas, who was his father, who was a little more, well, he was a military leader, so that was a little more at my speed than the literary one.
Yeah, and we won't really talk about Hugo other than referencing it later that they were friends and contemporaries. There's a lot going on in the script, and I just wanted to try to get an overview and get everything done in one episode this time as opposed to breaking it up. But yeah, Alexander Dumas. Sorry, before we begin on Alexander Dumas' life, we must begin with including his family history. Particularly, we'll talk about his father's side and his father, and his mother, so his grandparents, of a French nobleman, Alexandre Antoine David de la Pelletière. Close enough. We will just refer to his grandfather as Antoine from now on. He was the oldest son in the family and would join the army under King Louis XV. King Louis XV was the grandfather of King Louis XVI, which will be important shortly. His grandfather left the military in 1732. You see, just because he was a noble doesn't mean he had money, and his younger brother Charles was living in a French colony called Saint-Domingue. Are you familiar with Saint-Domingue?
Saint-Domingue? Yeah.
Saint-Domingue, yeah.
Yeah.
It's Haiti today. It's the western part of Hispaniola in the country of Haiti that we know of. You see, Saint-Domingue was known for its sugarcane plantations, and it was the most profitable of all France's colonies at this time due to its sugar production. Charles became a sugarcane plantation owner, and Antoine, seeing how much money that sweet cane can rake in, joined him and Charles's new wife. So far, I'm painting a pretty sweet image, pun intended. Time to ruin that. Saint-Domingue was only profitable as a colony due to the forced labor of African slaves. Of course, in that case of this colony, as well as almost all Caribbean colonies, the first slaves were the natives of the land, which, for lack of a better description, their populations were decimated due to Europeans enslaving the population that was, either wiped out by the slavery, war, disease, famine, you name it. Just the good stuff, right? The normal stuff we all know.
I mean, Hispaniola itself, since it was, I think it was the second island, or maybe the first that Columbus stepped on, it was decimated much more voraciously by the Spanish than some of the other ones surrounding it. So their native Taino were, I think, basically gone within 50 years. There's still people out there descendant from them, but it was in a couple thousands after being in like hundreds of thousands on the island.
Yeah, especially on the western side that we know of Haiti as well. Sugarcane work itself is also considered to be one of the most brutal work imaginable as a slave or anywhere. Imagine having the harvest in the hot, humid, just absolutely terrible Caribbean heat all day long. That reedy plant getting splinters in your unprotected hands, working all day, every day for the rest of your life. The average lifespan of a person who was abducted, forced into slavery, and finally forced to work in a sugarcane plantation outside but in general, actually, was only 7 years after they ended up on said plantation, shorter for those who actually worked in the fields. This would seem unsustainable, but it's hard to over-exaggerate just how many slaves were taken from Africa to satisfy the European sweet tooth at the time. And if you hear hiccups, guys, that's because my little dollar is strapped to my chest.
And a little baby Bjorn.
And a little baby Bjorn. You might hear a hiccup or two. She's very cute, isn't she? Hi. Hi.
Yeah. So when you're talking about French slavery in Saint-Domingue, I think it's what Phil said is important, but like the punishments too. And I don't know if you have a note on that, but yeah, some of the most brutal punishments in history of slavery, which is saying something. I can only think of like 2 equivalent places to be a slave in. I mean, being a slave is horrific no matter what, but like the levels that Saint-Domingue was is historically, if not the worst, at least in the top 3. And the other ones are antebellum deep South America, and then like a Roman slave in a mine, which was a death sentence. Those are the only things you could compare it to. It was pretty horrific, especially, well, at least when you talk about the transatlantic slave trade.
Well, yeah, and the transatlantic slave trade tends to be one of the most horrific parts of slavery history. Antoine and Charles's relationship, so the 2 brothers, would eventually falter as they fought violently one evening, and Antoine would move to, I think it's Jeremy, Saint-Domingue, so all the way on the western side, the southwest, where he would switch from sugarcane to cocoa and coffee. He still had a plantation full of slaves, don't get me wrong. In fact, Antoine even purchased a slave named Marie Cosette Dumas. Now, that name should sound familiar to you. I should note that there is only one place where her full name was recorded. Often she was just known as Marie or Marie Cosette, but her last name is obviously important because of reasons. The surname, Dumas, has 2 potential origins, right? The distinguished Cameroonian French author Calixte Bayala, claims that the name comes from the region present-day Gabon, initially spelled a little bit differently than what you would imagine, and originates from the ethnic group of that lives in the region called the Fang. The name Dumas in their language means dignity. Her name also could have originated from slave traders that captured her, and to confirm that she was part of the property, which is of the farm. When asked, her slavers said that she was Dumas, or in English, from the farm, meaning she was part of the property, which honestly I'm more willing to believe the latter than the former, only because it's a French name, Dumas, though it's spelled similarly. There's only one gap.
I mean, yeah, if you're between those 2, you're going to go with the simpler answer, which is not a territory in present-day Gabon. So, yeah.
Either way, Marie Cosette, to put it bluntly, was Antoine's sex slave. As Antoine bragged, she was purchased for an exorbitant price. Now, this isn't to say that they didn't have some kind of affection for one another, but whatever affection there was is deeply overshadowed by the power imbalance of the male master and female slave relationship that they had. Especially one where, at least in the sources I read, was explicitly intended for her to be his concubine. Not much is known about Marie Cosette other than the sale of her as property, her death, and that she bore Antoine probably 2 daughters and had a relationship before Antoine purchased her, so she had a 3rd, and bore Antoine 1 son. This would be Thomas Alexander Dumas, and he would be the father of Alexander Dumas, père. That's today's protagonist, right? Mm-hmm. Now, it's unclear to me if Thomas, as I will call him to simplify things, was born into slavery, as people were in the United States automatically, based off of our laws. The slaves in this country would basically be born every single time as slaves because of the laws that dictate anybody born under the mother. If the mother was a slave, the person who was born under the mother is a slave as well. That isn't always the case throughout all of slavery. A lot of times you are born free.
Yeah, in Haiti, it really was up to the master whether their offspring off the children, off the women that they ostensibly raped,
Well, not ostensibly.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they raped. It's rape. Unless, yeah, they raped. There's no unless. So it was up to them whether that child would be free or not. And sometimes they would just have them working in the fields, even though that was their daughter or son.
Yeah. Well, what I'd say here is that he wasn't necessarily automatically a slave, but his father did eventually sell him into slavery. Now, this sounds fucked up, because it is, but it actually comes with a crazier story. You see, Antoine's father died in 1758. This meant that their claim as the Marquis de la Pelletterie was his, as he was the firstborn child. However, his brother Charles, who we spoke of earlier, he wanted the claim for himself. His sugarcane farm wasn't working so good anymore due to the British blockade. As the 7 Years' War was happening, we Americans refer to this period as the French and Indian War. And none of his goods were making it to France, which basically was the only place he could sell his goods at the time due to the laws. It got to the point where he would ship his product to a neutral part of the island before sending it out. And today, that part of the island is in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic, the province where this is now called Monte Cristi. That area would eventually be widely recognized as the inspiration for the Count of Monte Cristo, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Antoine, the older brother, said, "LOL, fuck that. That be my title, yo." And he was right, totally in the weird, terrible ancestral noble law or whatever dumb shit, nobility believes in. But, according to the law, he was correct. This meant that both of them had to go back to their family estate in Normandy. Antoine, being the father he was, wanted to take his firstborn son and only son at that point to France with him. However, again, this was the middle 1700s and things weren't free. He had to get creative to get both of them over. So he sold his 14-year-old son into slavery for 800 French livres as a way to provide both a legal way to have Thomas taken to France with him and provide him a way to get to France as well. He sold him basically on a temporary loan for his own passage, and then his father purchased him back from the persons that he sold it to when landing in France, which is kind of confusing, but somehow he made a legal agreement to sell his son into slavery temporarily.
I mean, it sounds more like a loan, because if he's getting money in France, then I guess he loaned his son out to somebody for some money and then paid him back to get his son back. Is that what it was? Like,
kind of, yeah. Like I assumed he was working on the ship at the time, his son, because as soon as they landed, that was it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He like
where he had some money in France to purchase his son back. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Also messed up, but yeah.
Yeah. What's it called? Shit. It's a show. Oh, he pawned his son.
Oh, Pawn Stars.
Pawn Stars.
Yeah, that's
yeah, he pawned his son off,
which is Dad of the Year material. Yeah.
Yeah. So don't worry. Before leaving Haiti, as we know it, Saint-Domingue, he also made sure to sell Thomas's mother and his two daughters, so his wife and his daughters, into slavery. So, at least keeping things equal, I guess. Now, Thomas Alexander Dumas will have a remarkable story of his own. Due to his father's status, he lived pretty comfortably, and due to his father's influence, he was educated and trained by highly skilled swordsmen. Now, I must remind the audience, this is still Europe in the 18th century. There's no way he was trained by somebody of entirely European ancestry. Instead, he was trained by a biracial free man called Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who was accomplished fencer, violinist, dancer, conductor, composer, and soldier.
Yeah, Chevalier. They made a not great but not terrible movie about him recently. Chevalier. It's just not bad to watch if you have some free time. But yeah,
there you go.
Yeah.
Antoine decided that his son would learn the way of the soldier, basically, and he did, in fact, become a soldier, a very, very successful one at that. And his timing couldn't have been better for a former slave, even if it was just a boat's ride length, to become a soldier in the French military. You see, there was something called the French Revolution happening roughly 3 years after he originally signs under the Queen's Dragoons. In 1792, he was put second in command of the Legion Franche d'Américain et du Midi, otherwise known as the American Legion, no, not that one, or the Black Legion, yes, that one, led by Chevalier de Saint-Georges. The guy who trained him in the fancy sword fighting. However, our boy Thomas often found he was first in command because St. George often went, LOL, I got better things to do than lead this Black Legion. The Legion did get quickly resolved because of the French Revolution, at least early on, and was based at the time, the basis was for racial equality, which kind of have to somewhat believe in because the French Revolution did have those undercurrents. Well, not the overcurrents.
At some points, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially
early on.
Yeah, when the Girondins came into power in 1791, there were a lot of emancipationist rhetoric under Brissot, which is me just saying words, but yeah. So there was a guy who was leading a faction in France named Brissot, who was an emancipationist, and he kept pushing for racial equality. So, probably a racist, but it's a sliding scale back then.
Well, yeah, I wrote here that equality is definitely graded on a curve here, for sure. Yeah, and we will also have to discuss some more race in France shortly around this time in present day, specifically around slavery. Thomas Alexander distinguished himself as an exemplary commander, earning the rank of general and the nickname, bear with me here, the Black Devil.
Yeah.
It's racist, but it's also badass.
Yeah.
Like it really is.
There's a book about Thomas called The Black Count too. I don't think anyone called him back then, but yeah.
No, I think they changed that for
to not be called the Black Devil on the book cover. Yeah.
He espoused the spirit of the French Revolution so much so that even like later on, when Robespierre became empowered, he was put on trial by the Committee of Public Safety, which, if you are put on trial by this committee, there's very little chance that you get set off freed. However, he somehow skated by and became one of the most important generals working under none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. Probably heard of him. He first worked with him in northern Italy, and then he was sent to Toulon for an unspecified assignment. You want to guess what that assignment was?
Taking Toulon.
No. He boarded the boat, and that was where he was told he was going to conquer Egypt.
Oh, yeah. Not sure what year. Yeah, that makes sense based on the year.
Yeah. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte and his troops did conquer Egypt, kind of, until they didn't. It turns out that frogs often don't survive in the desert. Napoleon Bonaparte partially... I'm glad that's the first joke that made you laugh.
I don't know, you calling that laughter.
Napoleon Bonaparte partially seeing the writing on the wall and also partially getting wind of the fall of the Committee of Public Safety, understand that if he was going to become the leader of France, this was the opportunity. He ditched the remaining troops in Egypt and left them to their own fates. Thomas Alexander, our protagonist's father, was one of those soldiers left behind. He was stranded in Egypt for over a year and somehow found passage back to France pretty much right in the nick of time before all the troops were doomed to a grisly fate in Egypt, only for that boat to sink, all of its cargo jettisoned, and the survivors to land in a hostile territory called the Kingdom of Naples in 1799. Thomas was imprisoned for around 2 years, and when he finally was released, he was partially paralyzed, blind in one eye, nearly deaf in 1 year, and overall a broken man and unfit for service, because he was tortured.
Was he on the southern peninsula or Sicily?
No, I actually don't know if he was in the peninsula or Sicily. I just know that at that point they broke away from the Empire of France partially for a couple years.
Yeah, for a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Sicily was, because it was an island, England could protect it in the Mediterranean, so it was this weird part of the Kingdom of Naples or Kingdom of Sicilies, of the two Sicilies, that basically was separate from the other part. There were like French expats living on the island of Sicily, like a king that you'll probably talk about.
Well, we'll talk about him shortly.
Yeah,
the Duc d'Orléans.
The Duc d'Orléans was hanging out on that island. Louis Philippe.
Yeah, we're going to talk about him actually because he's much more important to the story than you expect.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to pivot sharply about race in the France at this point in time because it will be important, as it always is, in understanding Alexander Dumas, who somewhat correctly and also somewhat self-loathingly was convinced that the color of his skin hindered him and society wouldn't fully accept him. He really had a hard time with his cultural upbringing at times of his life. I honestly wanted to add some of it, but I decided that his story is too good. And just know that there were points of his life to just, society really was not good for anybody who was of mixed race and former slave heritage. I mean, it's never good.
Not even in like Haiti,
No,
especially back exactly around this time. But yeah,
we already went over slavery in Haiti, at least in Saint Domingue, and slaves outnumbered their masters in crazy ratios, like 10-1 over there, or even higher. Even like it was far more people who enslaved than masters. There's also a whole class system set up by the Spanish, I think, but also the French, that I have absolutely not enough time to get into. But eventually there were even words created, classes created based on how much white and black ancestry you have, where you were born, how you were born, who your parents were. It's unbelievably complex and crazy that somebody even has the time to do it. But I guess you had more time back in the day because television didn't exist and you were bored and a racist. During the French Revolution, slavery was abolished in the colonies officially. Kind of. However, the French Revolution was perpetual, and Napoleon Bonaparte reversed that policy. Definitely. Napoleon Bonaparte even sent troops to Haiti to try and get the freed men and women back into shackles for the sake of making that sweet, sweet sugarcane stacks, yo. This didn't work. And I will not delve into the Haitian Revolution because this is already the second revolution that we're talking about. It's a wild story that ends with former slaves basically massacring every white person on the island, with the exception of the Polish fighters who were brought over by the French, learned about the atrocities of slavery and what the French and English did during the Haitian Revolution, and were like, nah, dog, we're switching sides. The Haitian Revolution scared the ever-living bejesus out of the U.S. and motherfucking A, so much so that it took over a century before they recognized Haiti even as a nation. I digress, though. Technically, slavery was abolished in France in 1318 by King Philip V, but those were just words on paper. Slavery was practiced in parts of France up until the French Revolution was reinstituted by Napoleon at the colonies, and then the slave trade itself was abolished by him again. However, there were places like Provence that was still continuously using slaves because it's on the southern coast, and who's actually from Paris going to stop them, kind of the situation. And then it happened to just continue and abolish slavery. And the slavery was abolished several times because people just kept ignoring it in France. It wasn't until 1848 where a decree abolished it permanently. And Jacek, I think you know what 1848 is all about. Yeah. We'll talk about that later. Briefly, because, again, we're in two revolutions deep, and this is France. Lastly, slavery wasn't abolished fully in French colonies because it was still definitely occurring in French West Africa, a French territory, until 1903, which means that the United States abolished slavery in its territories before France did, if you simply ignore like half a sentence in the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. I did not know about this. And, we have a horrible, horrible chattel slavery in this country, but you know what? Like, the Europeans don't really have a leg to stand on that one.
No, no, they don't. I mean, they're the ones who came here too. I mean, it's their influence on America and on the island. It's their influence on the continent, but like it's also 100% America's fault for owning slaves and continue the institutions. But like, yeah. They're not good. No. They're not good. I mean, even like British slave trade, I think it was 1820 something. I might be off by a couple decades, which isn't great. But
yeah, and if you forget just like the caste system that they continue to perpetuate in India.
William Wilberforce might have been a good guy, but like they kept slavery in all but name in their colonies, and especially throughout the 19th century into the early 20th century, where basically it was slavery in all but name in places in Africa.
This is important context to continue because again, we're talking about Alexander Dumas, and if you've ever seen the movie Django Unchained, there's a famous scene in it where Leonardo DiCaprio was told by Christoph Waltz that Alexander Dumas was black, right? Very famous scene. And if I spoiled that for you, I'm sorry, but watch the movie that's like 2 decades old. Now, we're 4 pages in, and we still haven't really even got to the birth of Alexander Dumas David de la Palliatere. I'm going to say that definitely different every single time, which occurred on 24 July 1802. But I think that it was interesting and necessary to put this context for him. Because he was born shortly after his father returned from being imprisoned, Thomas Alexander struggled to find good work due to his physical condition. He was also refused the hero's pension he deserved by Napoleon Bonaparte himself, even though he absolutely deserved it. He wrote to Napoleon many times asking for the back pay when he deserved when he was in the army for a new commission to help support his family. Napoleon totally ghosted the guy. He left him stranded in Egypt like a dickhead. And like, there's one battle about a mosque. I'm not entirely sure. That I forgot what exactly happened because I didn't write it down. But there's a famous portrait of this battle, and Thomas Alexander isn't even part of it, even though Napoleon Bonaparte had the portrait commissioned. I mean, it was finished after he passed away, but like this is the level of erasure that we're talking about with race here.
It's not like documented, but like Napoleon was probably a racist. I mean, he tried to
reinstituted slavery
in Haiti. Yeah. He tried to reinstitute slavery in Haiti, and he did it throughout the French colonies. He was a piece of shit.
Yeah.
Also, interesting guy, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to learn about him in order for you to understand Europe, in the world. I mean, realistically, world history. Alexander, he was his only son, Thomas's only son, and he was only 3 years old when his father passed away impoverished. Father died in 1806 due to stomach cancer, which is kind of coincidental because people believe that's also how Napoleon Bonaparte died of stomach cancer. They're not entirely sure. And after Napoleon Bonaparte passed away, a new king was restored to the French throne, King Charles X. We're not going to talk much about 10th, but a little bit.
Well, it was Louis XVIII for a decade, and then his brother, Charles X.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Alexander's formal education was brief. He went to school at Abbe Gregory in 1811, and at the age of 9, he was there for 2 years. At the age of 14, he becomes a clerk for a solicitor in Commune de Villiers-Cotterêts, which is near Paris. I think now it's actually a suburb of Paris. However, the study of law did not suit him. Instead, he moves to Paris and gets a job working for the Duc d'Orléans as a scribe. So he works directly under the Duke, which is crazy, actually. He only got this job mainly because of his father's aristocratic rank and his father's service to the country, and also just by the virtue of his beautiful handwriting. Literally. You see, the Duc d'Orléans will be very important really soon, but before he moves, that's our boy Alexander, he meets a guy named Adolphe de Livion, which you don't see a lot of people with the name Adolf for some reason.
Yeah.
Who knows why?
Something happened.
Yeah. This guy, Adolf would be instrumental in helping the young Alexander in his writing career. Adolf was a French theater director and playwright, and the illegitimate son of Adolf Ribbing, who was involved in the assassination of King Gustav II of Sweden. Not important, but interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was after his move to Paris where he immersed himself in literature. 16 years old, I think, at this point, probably 18. He was also immersed himself into his lifelong vice, which was women. Alexander was, for a lack of a better term, a philanderer. And
a French writer, a philanderer?
I know, right? Just a French person, a philanderer, I guess. And I've got crap about making fun of French people in the stereotype that they don't really respect the institution of marriage. But like every single time I like read about the French and their culture,
in Paris
in the 19th century, it's like, there's a reason why this stereotype exists. It's like all of them.
I mean, if you had money,
not even money, like just some sort of credibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know, you were a little well known. Also, I mean, he hung out with actors and actresses like all the time, not necessarily known for their belief in monogamy. Alexander, again, was a philanderer, and we won't have time to get into his love life that much, just to let you know that he would have liaisons with many women, one estimated stating around like 40 total throughout his life, which, you know, if this was one night stands at a random bar, doesn't sound that crazy, but like this isn't. These are courtships, and having multiple at the same time. And I say this because one of his first courtships in Paris was Marie-Laure Catherine Labbé, and that's a hyphenated first name, Marie-Laure Catherine, like Thomas Alexander. There's going to be a lot of those. They would have a son together, also named Alexander Dumas, Fil, which means son in French, or in English, we would call him Alexander Dumas Jr. or the Younger, while his father would be known as Senior or Père in French. It's confusing, but to put a bow on Alexander Dumas the Younger, he was also a very successful playwright himself and novelist, though the English world will not really be familiar with his works because his father just overshadows him after the translations. It was pretty well recognized and well known by his own accord in the later part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. His son was born on 27 July 1824 when his father was only 22 years old. And that's pretty much the last we're going to talk about Fil, because it's we're just going to have to focus on Dumas. Any questions?
No. What year? I mean, we're 1822, so we're still in the. I think it would be Louis the 18th, but it might be Charles. But yeah, just wondering what time period we're talking about.
During the early years of Paris, he also began writing plays with that guy Adolphe and worked in famous theaters. They co-wrote a play together called Hunting and Loving in English, which was performed in 1825. 4 years later, on February 10th, 1829, the first play that Alexander Dumas wrote by himself and performed occurred at the Comédie Française. The play, in English, is called Henry II and His Court, and though it did not become a smash hit, it is widely recognized as one of the initial feats in French Romantic theater. Dumas' fame as a writer began that fateful night, and he would continue to write plays and work as a scribe for the Duc d'Orléans until Monday, July 27th, 1830. Now, Jacek, why do you think I'm posing a question revolving around a specific date?
Birthday party? I'm not sure.
I mean, it's pretty close. I guess that it's a pretty good celebration.
I mean, I know exactly what I was just being.
I know.
Facetious.
I figured. All that, yeah, that's pretty true. But what is certain is that the French love a good protest. And if that protest turns into a full-scale revolution, then even better.
So much happier.
Yeah, they're so much happier. Because the July Revolution of 1830 broke out in the streets of Paris. Now, we got a yada, yada, yada here because this isn't even the last revolution we're going to be discussing. And this isn't even one that is the most important in the grand scheme of French revolutions. Simply put, King Charles X, the guy who was put on the throne basically after, a few years after Napoleon's exile and Louis XVIII getting the throne first, right? He sent out decrees, now known as the July Ordinances, which restricted voting rights of the middle class, suspended the liberty of press, dissolved a branch of government, and called for new elections. This occurred after years of rising tensions between the royalty and the normies, and the fear that the king was consolidating too much power. Any of this sound familiar to the present day at all?
I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, let's talk about Charles X. He was an ultra-conservative guy, the brother of Louis XVIII and Louis XVI. The guy got his head chopped off during the French Revolution. He's the youngest. And during the entire time, he was this irascible, asshole during making things a little more difficult for both his brothers during the reigns by his ultra-conservatism. Louis XVIII, when he was in charge, besides being an obese, kind of obese at the time, I guess, but this unhealthy man who died pretty early, he liked to kind of hold this middle ground between the two sides of the political aisle at the time, which would have been what we see as pretty conservative still, because it's only a few 100,000, probably less, people could actively participate in politics. But Charles X was just a prick. He tried to get everybody's. So during the French Revolution, a lot of aristocrats got their properties taken away because the people at the time thought it was bullshit that those people had all those land titles.
Yeah,
and Charles X tried to reinstate the properties to these noble families based on ancient decrees and stuff. That's the type of guy we're talking about.
Yeah, did he also try to give all that land back to the Catholic Church?
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, after the Catholic Church, I mean, they had so much land that they didn't need, but So, I mean, the July Revolution of 1830, 3 days of unrest and revolution in the streets of Paris, where everybody was in turmoil. It resulted in the overthrow of the king, the Charles X, and the installation of a new dynasty, the Orleans, which I don't think it was actually a dynasty, being that there was only one person, but whatever. That's right. Our boy Louis Philippe, the person that hired Alexander Dumas to be his scribe because of his beautiful handwriting. The penmanship worked out. Somehow, the sword was not mightier than the pen at this point. Thinking about that. Crazy. Alexander Dumas participated in the streets of Paris during the Revolution, though I couldn't find too much of the action he did. This is what Alexander Dumas had to say about the progression of the July 1830 Revolution in one of his memoirs. Quote, "From that moment, the generous promises made by Charles X on his ascension to the throne were valued at their true worth. And who shall say that one of the clouds that caused the storm of 27 July 1830 was not whirled into being on 18 October 1824, unquote. The day 1824, and what I'm referencing is because a funeral of his friend, a different guy named Philippe, not Louis Philippe. I know it's confusing. On that day, Charles X refused to receive his funeral, or to see and Philippe was like this very famous actor at the time. So he was just like some rich prick that was refusing to allow a funeral to go by. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. Ooh. Hey, buddy. Alexander Dumas resigns from Louis Philippe's offices in 1831, and he continues to write plays after the Revolution. And his first real success of a play was called Antony, which is considered to be the first non-historical romantic drama. You know, we're going to talk about the Romantic movement a little bit because it's based on historical figures largely, at least in France. You will see this a lot in his work and in the work throughout this time frame. An example of this is Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, partially based on the unrest in another revolution, basically, that occurred in Paris in 1832, which we cannot get into. Romantic literature's characteristics emphasize evocative emotions over rational thought, flowery language of vivid sensations and sensory details. It idolizes the past while focusing on the individual and their ability to break through convention. It holds nature into high esteem, and in a time of war, economic uncertainty, political upheaval, and disease is pretty rampant in the 19th century. It's understandable that people wanted to read things that made them feel like they could escape the reality they lived in. Again, any of this sound familiar? Blank stares. And escape Alexander Dumas did. Well, not literally. Literary. He began to travel a lot throughout Europe in the 1830s. And with his travels came the first nonfiction books he wrote. Today we would call this travel writing, but back in the day these are just described as travel logs of different cultures. It was a different version of a travel show on TV, except instead of seeing Anthony Bourdain relishing in some weird chicken soup after showing the locals how the locals slaughtered the animal on television and making fun of the vegans' sensitivity, you get to read about it. Rest in peace, Anthony. You're a good Jersey boy. You were a real one. I just love that you made fun of vegans, even though I have a lot of vegan friends. Yeah. It's really funny that was okay back in the day.
Yeah. Some of this, he was a real one, though.
He was a real one.
Yeah.
Yeah. When he returns to France, not fucking or Anthony Bourdain, that's actually kind of dark. When he returns to France, Alexander Dumas marries actress Ida Ferrier. The two would be married until her death in 1859, so for almost 20 years. This did not stop old Dumas boy from having affairs with many other women. In fact, he had 4 children total. We already spoke of Alexander Dumas Fil, but in 1831, Marie Alexandrine Dumas, so he named after his mother and himself, was born from another actress called Melanie Serre while he was married to his wife. He also fathered Henry Bauer, who was the son of Anna Bauer, the wife of an Austrian commercial agent that was living in Paris. And lastly, at 1860, shortly after his wife's death, Michaela, Cléelle, Josepha, Elixabeth, that's a weird word, Elixabeth Cordier was born, the daughter of Emile Cordier, another actress. We are shotgunning through these relationships because there's more interesting stuff to talk about. But again, it's not helping the fact that the French stereotypes that you have 4 children with 4 different women and none of them is your wife.
And I feel like those women were on deck, like as soon as they realized they were dying, or like even before, like he was prepared to get remarried immediately.
There's no way his wife didn't know.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Every time.
I mean, she's an actress. She was probably having affairs too. I mean, listen, like he had an affair with somebody who was the wife of an Austrian commercial agent. Like and had a kid with him. Like that's pretty crazy. Alexandra, of course, continues to write. This is how he was making his money. It was early in 1840s when he switched from writing mostly plays, essays, and travel writing to what he's known best for, at least in the Anglophone world, his romantic novels. It took many attempts, however, for him to publish his first novel in 1838 called Captain Paul, which originally was a play he rewrote and serialized into a novel. You see, he was pretty good at rewriting things and making it into novels. We will get into it when we cover the Three Musketeers, but he was a prolific writer, definitely. But a lot of what he did was actually rewrite old things and make them into something new. That's why he was able to publish 3 megaliths in a year that we're going to talk about shortly. He also published a book called The Fencing Master, which took place in Russia during the Decembrist Revolution, another revolution, Jacek. This book actually got him banned from Russia by Tsar Nicholas I, and he would only get allowed into Russia after Tsar Nicholas I caught a cold and died of pneumonia in 1855. He was banned for 15 years. Now, we're going to jump ahead for narration's sake. But you want to talk about the Decembrists? Because other than the fact that they
we don't have to talk about the Decembrists. I was just going to say being banned in Russia back then is kind of a rite of passage for anybody with any liberal leanings. It was pretty easy to get banned from Russia.
Yeah. Oh, Valencia is all I have to say. Now we're going to have to jump ahead. Like I said, Alex does visit Russia in 1859, where a lot of his works are beloved by the Russian nobility because the nobles speak French, not Russian, to one another. And they, honestly, a lot of them didn't even know their own nation's language because it's how isolated they were from the common peasant.
Yeah.
Just
it was
crazy.
The language of the commoner. In their wars and throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, they just couldn't speak to the common soldier. I mean, not just because Russia has a bunch of different languages, but like even the Russians were just not able to talk to the commanding officers because they just didn't speak any of the language. So it didn't make the Russian military that competent.
No. So he was touring there. He had a good time. They loved his work. It's pretty crazy. He was a celebrity there. But 1843 to 1844, moving back now, will become the most prolific years of his life, or some of them. It began with the publication of a short novel called Georges. This was a short book, like I said, considering almost all of his works are megaliths. This was about the life of Georges, the son of a wealthy planter in the French colony of Mauritius, located in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. Georges is a mixed race, but passes as being white due to the lightness of his skin, which ultimately saves him in the end of the book. Other than the interesting racial component, this book is important because the plot themes in the book are similar to those in one of the greatest accomplishments, The Count of Monte Cristo, which he begins publishing in 1844 and will be published in installments until 1846. He also published books such as the novelization of the Russian ballad The Nutcracker, one of the most famous works, and his most famous works, arguably other than the Count of Monte Cristo. He published The Three Musketeers in 1844, and lastly a book called The Corsican Brothers. For the last book that I just mentioned, The Corsican Brothers, he teamed up with the fencing master, Augustin Gressier, who had been friends with him for at least since the return back in Paris in 1840. And Augustin was also credited for helping him write the book that got him banned from Russia, called The Fencing Master, which we already talked about. Now, it is my goal to go into depth into what I think is his most famous book nowadays, at least one that I credit to be his most famous work, called The Three Musketeers, in a separate episode soon. But Jacek, I wanted to know if any of these other books sounded familiar to you.
Sorry, the books you already. I thought you were going to give me a list.
No.
I was waiting for a list. No. Yeah. Besides the Count of Monte Cristo, I think you mentioned the other ones I haven't really heard of.
Yeah. I think there's also the Man with the Iron Mask is very famous as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll talk about how much he actually published shortly. In 1844, Alexander Dumas joins a new club. This club included France's literary giants at the time, like Victor Hugo, who he was good friends with basically all of his life, even after Victor accused him of plagiarizing one of his books, which, I mean, we'll talk about what Alexander Dumas did to write The Three Musketeers in that episode. Other members included Charles Baudelaire, Gerard de Nerval, and Honoré de Balzac, which was a real person. Not a made-up name at all.
And it's spelled Balzac, right?
No, it's Balzac, but it's pronounced Balzac. Legit. Pretty crazy. And he's like one of the France's greatest writers. I will definitely do one about him.
It's a bummer,
because,
though.
yeah, and Pierre Goriot is like one of the more famous books that he did. But, yeah, he was all France. All that is France. Now, you want to know what this club that he joined was called, Jacek?
Club Massiac.
Club de Hashishans.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Or in English, the Club of Hashish Eaters. The club was dedicated to the exploration of drugs and the drug experiences. They met monthly at the Hotel de la Liaison, where they would take drugs and take part in these things called seances, which all I saw was seances. I didn't get too deep into it.
Yeah.
But they would basically... They would take hash. It would either smoke... It says eat it, but it looks like they smoked it mostly.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, hash is concentrated... concentrated... hashish is concentrated hemp extract, basically, that has been around for a few thousand years now.
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me they smoked it. Yeah.
I've only done it once in Ireland, honestly, because it was only one of the only ways to get high, and like with THC, it was like easier to smuggle than pot. It smells less, and you know the thing in Europe to do over there was to basically roll spliffs of it. So yeah,
I've never done hashish.
It's like fine.
Yeah,
gives you a crazy head rush, but yeah. Very illegal in Ireland. Apparently, you can go to jail for a long time.
Oh,
whatever.
Cool,
right? Now we're smoking fat dabs being given out in the streets over here. And you know what? No kids are getting higher than they used to. Like, literally, pot use for teenagers and younger have dropped precipitously.
That does make sense, yeah.
Yeah. Duh.
Because there's no illegal
trade. Yeah. There's no shady fucking people selling legal drugs to your kids anymore.
You don't have to go 20 miles with your friends to go to some guy they might have pot.
No, you just steal it from your parents' cabinet, and even that they're not even doing that. Yeah. This club, the Hashish Eaters, lasted from 1844 to 1849. It's quite a long time. It lasted for that long because of the reasons we're talking about right now. This time period also corresponded with some of the busiest parts of Dumas's life outside of his writing. In 1847, fresh from his novel successes and apparently flush with some cash, he opens up Theatre Historique in February, where plays from his novels and his own plays were performed regularly. Also in 1847, he does what many people who just got a boatload of money do. He purchases land and builds a country home in Le Port Marly. He names the estate the Chateau de Monte Cristo.
No.
Checks out.
It's like Shakespeare's son being called Hamnet or something. Like, it's the same kind of.
Well, like the Dilbert guy.
Made the Dilbert house. That's closer to that one, yeah.
Dilbert the swimming pool, yeah. It's like, I guess you got to give credit where credit's due in that one.
Fuck the Dilbert guy, though.
Yeah, that guy, yeah. He publishes like half a dozen books in 1847 alone, and around that, he just keeps on traveling, this time to Spain and North Africa. He is traveling a lot throughout his life. I mean, granted, he doesn't leave Europe or Northern Africa, but, I mean, it's the 19th century. It's not that easy. This all sounds great, right? He's high on the hog. He's wealthy. He's buying estates and Just the normal stuff you do when you make a lot of money all at once. Now, I've thrown a lot of years. Hey, girl, welcome to the podcast. But we've arrived in the year 1848, and this is a huge year in European history.
Phil, before you go on, I just want to point out. So, North Africa at the time, it was sort of before the 1830 revolution, Charles X tried to launch a war to get his approval ratings, I guess, up in Algiers because of some debt shenanigans that the French did, which began the French occupation, I guess, the whole process of them taking over most of the Maghreb, I think almost all of the Maghreb, which is Western North Africa. So when he's going to North Africa, he's going to pretty Frenchified areas of the country of the world at the time.
Yeah, and from that moment on, isn't Algeria part of France? Like it permanently was kind of just like a public ploy in order for him to try to get an approval rating, and then like Algeria becomes French Algeria.
Yeah, he gets overthrown before the end of the war, and Philippe just had to take it. And I mean, it wasn't against any scruples for him to take it, but this
is before the scramble of Africa too, right?
Yeah. But eventually, like Tunisia and Morocco become protectorates and French possessions in all but name. But
70 years later, we get Albert Camus, so at least we have that came out of that.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the genocides.
it's totally worth the genocides. That's totally sarcastic, guys. Somebody's going to clip that, and that's it. So 1848, right? So this is a huge year in European history, and something we aren't taught really in the U.S. of motherfucking A much. But during this year, in some places, 2 years, a revolutionary fervor erupts all over Europe and even spread to places like Latin America. It's hard to summarize this revolution in a few sentences, but I'm sure shit gonna try. All the poors in Europe were like, WTF. They saw the rich were hoarding all the money and had all the political power, and a widespread feeling of injustice swept throughout the land, sparked by things like rising nationalism, national identity, and a potato famine that hit large portions of Europe. Liberal and democratic ideals, such as freedom of the press and participation in democracy, were espoused in pamphlets and literature. So regular old workers began to revolt, starting in Italy and spreading to neighboring countries. Places like Ireland and Poland, which were not independent nations at the time, fought to regain their national identity from their occupiers. Revolution swept countries such as the German Confederation, Hungary, Denmark, just to name a few. What this meant for France was the fall of the constitutional monarchy of King Louis Philippe and the creation of the French Second Republic. The person who was elected president of this republic ultimately ended up being Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the great Napoleon, now not the dynamite one. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, so Louis Napoleon, in terms of political figures, he's the guy who reminds me most of Trump, in which he's this cartoonish guy who gets elected because everyone else is this tainted mess, basically, in the political structure. He's not a bright guy in terms of his ability to run shit, but he is he has this knack of getting people to think he is the ultimate person to fix your problems. And I don't know if you're going to get into it, but he does eventually become, because of his incompetency, become captured.
We're not going to get into the Franco-Prussian War.
In the Franco-Prussian War.
Briefly talk about it. No.
Yeah. I mean, he gets captured in a war because he decided to lead it himself. So
we're not talking about it because the timeline doesn't check out mostly, and
we don't
also
have to talk about it. I just think it's funny.
It's not a revolution.
That he gets captured.
What a wacko.
Yeah.
For Alexander, he participated in the revolution by trying to get elected as a member of parliament. He did not succeed. The revolution turned out to be bad for him, in fact. His theater barely survived the physical destruction of Paris. Well, it was just never financial to begin with, and you're talking about a revolution throughout the whole year, right? He got deep into debt, so much so that he had to auction off the Chateau de Monte Cristo only after 2 years of living there. In 1850, his theater went bankrupt, and he had to sell it as well. He also personally goes bankrupt himself due to all the debts he piled up. The following year, Louis Napoleon staged a coup and established himself as a dictatorial emperor of the Second French Empire and took the name of Napoleon III. Dumas was a vocal opponent of the new emperor, and even though he was basically just a wannabe and nothing like his uncle, not the kind of wannabe that, the Spice Girls sing about, the real kind of wannabe, being vocally opposed to a dictator can cause you some trouble. Alexander had to flee France, along with many other romantic writers such as Victor Hugo, where both lived in Brussels, Belgium for a short time. Alexander lived there for a little bit longer because Hugo had his own story, somehow going to the Isle of Guernsey. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's by Jersey. It's the Channel Islands, right?
Yeah.
Channel Islands or Chattel?
Channel Islands.
Channel Islands.
And I think you were pretty Guernsey. Yeah.
It's an English. I don't know actually. Is it English back then? Part of Great Britain or the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, probably
they
is.
took all those islands even at some point.
Yeah, even though it's right off the coast of France.
Yeah, I mean I don't know the exact history of Guernsey, but it could have been from all the way back to the 100 Years' War that they owned it. And
the most I know about those islands is the fact that one of them is called Jersey. We're from New Jersey, and also that there was a pretty decent rugby club called the Jersey Reds that were part of the second tier of the English rugby system for a very long time, and even beat the nation of Russia right before Russia went off to the World Cup. Like they beat them, like just second tier club, then went bankrupt a few years later because all of English clubs are going bankrupt because they just mismanaged their money. Also because of things like mismanaging the entire nation and deciding that you wanted to pull out of the EU.
No, but they got that new deal, so they're fine.
They're fine. Yeah, the great deal with the United States.
Going fine.
Things are great there. Alexander had to flee France, like I said. It turned out, however, that Napoleon III had very little bite in this loud, small, barking dog. And after negotiating his bankruptcy, Alexander ended up returning back to France. Toward the later part of his life, Dumas travels quite a lot. We mentioned that he already went to the Russian Empire. Basically, upon his return in 1859, he also travels to Italy. There, he meets with Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Cool guy.
Giuseppe, other than having the most Italian name ever possible, was an Italian general and played a massive role in unifying Italy into the Kingdom of Italy, or basically what we know as Italy today. Because before, Italy was not at all unified before this guy, but broken up into different kingdoms, where he talked about the Kingdom of Naples. Dumas really liked Garibaldi, and they became friends. I'm just really realizing, so I don't know if this is related to it, but there's a trophy in rugby called the Garibaldi Trophy.
It might have been, yeah.
Is it? Because it's the trophy between... It's a trophy that's battled over between France and Italy during the Six Nations.
So Garibaldi is an interesting guy. I'm sure someone's gonna be mad that I said he was a cool guy, but I might not be. I don't think I'm confusing with Mazzini, but I think Garibaldi was born in Nice, and he was part of the 1848 Second French Republic, their constitutional convention, because even though Nice was French at the time, it was like an Italian city. He was technically part of the French government at some point, and the guy who helped unify Italy. But I might be thinking of another guy named Giuseppe Mazzini, who was even a cooler guy and wore a sombrero. It might not have been a sombrero, Peruvian hat everywhere when he was traveling around Italy trying to unify it. He was a cool guy. Anyways, being named Giuseppe was like one of the prerequisites for being an Italian revolutionary back then. There's about 15 other Giuseppes out there, which is just Joseph, but still.
Yeah. Garibaldi and Dumas became fast friends. Even so that when the revolution was happening or the unification was happening, Dumas helped Garibaldi in his mission by going to the French city Marseille and buying rifles for his troops, meaning that he had a direct hand in unifying Italy somehow. Garibaldi does not become a king, of course. Instead, that goes to Victor Emmanuel II, but Garibaldi had a significant role in running the country afterwards. For his efforts, Dumas was granted the chief of excavations and museums in Naples, but by his pal Giuseppe himself, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. This guy has done a ton, right? He's constantly writing. In his later life, he publishes a lot of books about his travels, his memoirs, books about his relationships with friendly people and famous people, right? However, we have gone on for a while, and it's time to kill off our main protagonists. On December 5th, 1870, Alexander Dumas died at the age of 68, one short of the nicest number to ever exist, possibly because of a heart attack, but because of natural causes in general. His death would have been bigger news if it were not for the fact that it occurred right in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War, where Prussia, which would later become one of the states that would run modern-day Germany, absolutely obliterated Emperor Napoleon III, right? I mean, he got curb stomped. He just got destroyed.
It wasn't even, it wasn't even, ultimately just outplayed completely by Oliver Bismarck. And immediately after the war, in the Palace of Versailles, which I think was the capital. No, it would be the capital after. Again, the second time Versailles was the capital. In the Hall of Mirrors, they created Germany because of that war.
Yeah. Yeah, if it wasn't for Napoleon III, we wouldn't have Germany.
We wouldn't have Germany, yeah.
So at least he's got
we also
that
wouldn't have Cinco de Mayo, which was recently, but that's another
that's true.
whole other thing.
Forgot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't have had an Austrian man on the throne of, of Mexico. It's tough to find the actual number of books he actually published because that's just not how things worked back in the day. I saw one source that said around 80 novels and books, like short books like that, around 50 plays. But the page number is well over 100,000 pages. Something like 200 movies and shows are produced based off his work. The last book published by him was done posthumously. You want to guess what date this is? What year?
1944.
You're like fucking way off.
By up or down?
Up.
Up?
Yeah.
2018.
Less than that, 2005.
Okay.
In English, it's called The Last Cavalier, which was unfinished at the time of his death and completed by the scholar Claude Schopp, which is decidedly not a French name, but, probably a French scholar. Before his death, though, Alexander Dumas started a different project, working on a different type of book. He began comprising a cookbook called The Dictionary of Cuisine. This book was also published in France a few years after his death. The full copy is extremely rare to find, and I'm not sure if any of the full copy actually exists in English itself. But if you want to buy an abridged version, and the hardcover copy right now is on sale for the paltry sum of $180. And for fun, I wanted to close out this episode by quoting the description of the book on Amazon. Quote, "A cookbook by the author of The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo may seem an improbability, yet Alexander Dumas was an expert cook. His love of food said to be equaled only to his love of women. And his great dictionary of cuisine written to be read by worldly people and used by professionals and published posthumously in 1873 is a masterpiece in its own right. This abridged version of the dictionary is designed to be both useful and entertaining. There are hundreds of recipes for sauces, soups, meats, fish, eggs, poultry, and game, well within the scope of an experienced and imaginative cook." And from the sources I've read on Amazon, I mean, these are not professionals. People tend to really like this, which is crazy. Any last thoughts, Jacek, before we go into plugs and sources?
No, just interesting. He lived a hell of a life, being especially of African descent in...
American descent, too.
Haitian descent, or French.
Yeah, American in the sense of, the continent, yeah.
And just the typical artist not knowing what to do with his money and failing.
Yeah. Nowadays we call those athletes. It's kind of crazy because the world around him was just revolving and constantly it was revolutionary, right? And he was just happened to be in the place and time where the revolutions were happening, right? A lot of it was in his control, a lot of it wasn't. So plugging my Patreon, it's Lost in the Library on patreon.com, right? Also, any questions, please send them to lostinthelibrarypodcast at Gmail. Please follow us on Instagram, again, Lost in the Library there. And I have a Substack where you can find my work at Fil Deptula, just my name. It's definitely under development, a lot of these, but, one thing at a time, still learning how to be a new father. Sources are my memoirs by Alexander Dumas, translated by E.M. Waller, found on Project Gutenberg, a number of articles on Dumas' père, .com in English, including Alexander Dumas, père and Fil, and many others. Harvard Magazine, Vita, Alexander Dumas, Brief Life of the Soldier Who Inspired the Count of Monte Cristo by Tom Rees. Biography.com articles, Lavish Burl for Three Musketeers on The Guardian. Al Ives' website and the biography of his life, A Black Slave, Marie Cesette Dumas by Jacobo Valescarez, many other articles, just like piecing things together, as well as some Wikipedia articles all about Alexander Dumas, Georges, July Revolution, 1848, Revolution, Adolphe de Louvain, Thomas Alexander Dumas, Marie Cesette Dumas, End of Slavery in France, and the Theatre Historique, as well as the Hashish Eater Club. Great.
Still very funny.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah.
Anything else before we head off?
No, thanks for having me and being able to see my niece again for the first time. I got to hold her today, which was pretty great.
Yeah, you met her literally when she was 2 days old.
Yeah.
And now she's a month. Crazy. All right. Till next time.